Brent Rathgeber was a Conservative member of Parliament for 5 years before quitting the government caucus to sit as an independent. At issue, a system of legislators that he says are more consumed by their own careers than the needs of their constituents, and a Prime Minister's office that makes all the decisions anyway. He's written it all down in a book called Irresponsible Government: The Decline of Parliamentary Democracy in Canada, and he joins us right now. Brent Rathgeber, independent member for the riding of Edmonton, St. Albert, and it's good of you to come to TVO tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Well, of course, the title of your book plays off on the fact that we're supposed to have in this country responsible government, which a lot of people actually don't understand. So why don't we start there? What's responsible government?
Well, responsible government was inherited from the British Westminster parliamentary system. Lord Durham recommended it to the United Colonies of Canada in 1840. And it's a very simple concept that the elected, or the executive, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet are composed of members of Parliament, but they are separate from it, and the entire House, the entire legislature, is supposed to hold the government to account, and the government is supposed to be responsible to the elected Parliament. And if, for whatever reason, the elected Parliament loses confidence in the Cabinet, that will trigger either a resignation of the government or an election, or sometimes both. But the theory of responsible government is that the Cabinet is separate from the legislature, although comprised for the most part of members of the legislature, and is responsible and accountable to the elected Parliament at all times.
Now, the second part of that we've actually seen in the last few years when the Harper government lost a vote of confidence and had to resign and go to the public for a renewed mandate, which it got. The first part of that, I suspect people don't know, which is that even government backbenchers are supposed to hold the government to account. How much of that did you see when you were part of the government caucus?
Almost none, and I think, and I talk about this in some length in the first couple chapters. The powers that be, the Prime Minister's office, the House leadership, the Whip, the government House leader, they encourage backbenchers to think of themselves as part of the government. You frequently see in talking points or in planted questions the pronouns like "our government" or "Mr. Speaker, we have been doing this for Canadians." And I think they actually encourage backbenchers to feel that they're part of the team, part of the government, thereby converting them effectively into less of checks and balances and more of cheerleaders for the government.
But the reality is they are. The reality is they get elected on Conservative colors, they get elected because Harper's the leader, they get elected running on a Conservative platform. How are they not part of the team?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on your view of representation. I think traditionalists, such as myself, believe that your first priority is always to your constituents, and your loyalty to your party leadership is secondary. But I absolutely agree that given the nature of our elections in the last, well, certainly in the TV era, they've certainly become leader-focused, and it's hard to make an argument against individuals who think of themselves as nothing but an extension of the leader's office, and therefore bound to follow the leader's wishes and the leader's instructions without questioning them. The problem is that runs counter with the system of government that we inherited in 1867 when we became a country, and in 1848 when we achieved responsible government, and that is that the Cabinet, the elected members of the Cabinet are supposed to be responsible to the House, the entire House. And when they are not, the system of checks and balances breaks down, and you have decisions that are made with not enough, or with frequently with no checks and balances, or second guessing of one's decisions, and often will also lead to scandals, as we saw about a year and a half ago with the interactions between Mike Duffy and the Prime Minister's office. Lacks of checks and balances between legislative and executive branches leads to nothing but problems, in my view.
I hear you, but I wonder whether or not things have evolved from 1867 to the point where now the government is one big team, regardless of whether you're in the Cabinet or on the backbench, and whatever checking and balancing of the government's power you want to do, you do it privately in caucus, and you leave it up to the opposition parties who relish the opportunity, daily and question period, to hold the government to account. I mean, that's kind of where we're at now, aren't we?
Well, I think the system has very much evolved into the system that you just described.
So what's wrong with that?
Well, there's a number of things wrong with it. If we are going to simply allow members of Parliament, the people that we elect and send to Ottawa at great expense, to be nothing other than the extension of their respective leaders' offices, we might as well convert us to an American system of an electoral college where, the first parliamentary meeting, the member of Parliament will pledge his unconditional support for that party leader, and then he can go home for the next 4 years because he's not going to question anything anyways. But the other question you asked was with respect to resolving differences behind closed doors. And certainly I was criticized even before I left the caucus for my tendency from time to time to question government decisions, $16 glasses of orange juice, limousines driving cabinet ministers around Ottawa. So the criticism is, well, we resolve the stuff behind closed doors, but when we make a decision, we leave here as a united team. The problem is, when you make decisions behind closed door, considerations other than the public interest are frequently not only discussed, they become prevalent, if not determinative. How is this decision going to affect our polling numbers? How is this decision going to affect our fundraising? Those types of questions are very, very important to party operatives and the individuals who are in charge of running elections. But they're of no concern to my constituents. They want me to represent them, not make a decision based on how it might affect polling numbers or fundraising initiatives.
Let me follow up on that, because you were elected, of course, on your name, Brent Rathgeber, but you were elected as a conservative running for the Conservative Party of Canada. And you're not part of that anymore. You're now sitting as an independent. Do you know or is it even possible for you to find out whether your constituents like you better as an independent MP rather than somebody who was a part of the debates in the Conservative government, who presumably had the possibility of influencing events inside the Conservative tent? What do they prefer?
Well, I know informally and ad hoc and anecdotally what their preferences are. When I left the caucus, it was a high-profile resignation on June 5th of 2013. I received close to 5,000 emails, most from my constituents, and the vast majority of them very, very positive. Those that were negative were quite negative. I mean, people who had donated to the party and were still working for the Conservative Party, I think were very upset with my decision, but that was well under 10%. But we're going to have an election in about 9 months.
Are you running again?
I am running again.
As an independent?
As an independent. So that will really test the theory of whether or not the people of Edmonton, St. Albert currently, and St. Albert, Edmonton in the new riding prefer an independent thinker who puts their interests in front of the party, or if they want a party loyalist who will represent the party to them. I mean, you may or may not know that in 2014, Maclean's magazine awarded me the Member of Parliament that best represents his constituents for that very reason, and that I take topics that are important to my constituents and raise them on the floor of the House, either through member statements or through questions during question period. I wasn't able to do that when I was a member of the caucus. All of my questions, all of my statements had to be vetted and pre-screened or written for me, and I was told to just go into the House and read them. So it's a better level of representation. I have no doubt of that. Whether or not I can convince the plurality of constituents of that point, I guess we'll test that in October.
But let's find out whether, as an independent MP, you still have the same access to cabinet ministers, to the Prime Minister, that you had when you sat in their caucus. What's the answer to that?
Oh, I don't. I mean, when I was a member of caucus, I had access to the cabinet ministers every Wednesday morning from about 9:30 till about noon during weekly caucus meetings. And if I needed to see a cabinet minister, I could usually get in within 10 to 14 days to talk about a legislative initiative.
So can you represent your constituents as well now that you don't have that kind of access that you once had?
Well, I think so, because although as a member of the caucus, I think I had consultative influence only. I mean, I had no leverage over any decision that the government wanted to make, and at the end of the day, the expectation was that I would follow it. I mean, my private member's bill, I think, is a wonderful case in point. At second reading, every member of the Conservative caucus voted in favor of my bill to have salary disclosure for the Federal Public Service and more meaningful disclosure at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. But then the Prime Minister's office decided that they were concerned about a number of bad news stories that would be written once it was determined exactly how many senior civil servants made over $200,000 and how much they were making. And once the Prime Minister's office withdrew the support for my bill, caucus support crumbled immediately thereafter. So although My point is, Steve, that although caucus supported my bill, they were powerless to save it in the face of a PMO pushback. So although members of caucus have access and get face time with the Prime Minister and get face time with members of the Cabinet, they don't have any real influence or power. It's the top-down approach to governance that we're faced with, and the real power in Ottawa is not in the elected parliament, and it's certainly not in the elected Conservative caucus. It's in the unelected Prime Minister's office.
I don't mean this to sound like a naive question, but there are, of course, more backbenchers than cabinet ministers. There are more backbenchers than prime ministers. If backbenchers wanted to get together as a force and force something through, they could. Why did they fold instead of support you?
Well, that wasn't their hill to die on. It became my hill to die on, and I resigned from the caucus the day after my bill got gutted at committee. The reality is our system encourages sycophancy and encourages people to unequivocally support the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office, because that's how careers are made and lost. We have, in my view, a grossly oversized cabinet now at 40 members out of a 162 or 163 member caucus. I think there are 31 parliamentary secretaries. Add 12 committee chairs, and you have half the caucus. So half of that caucus has some extra pay and some extra prestige and some at least perceived influence, although I would say that's more perceived than real.
That they owe to Stephen Harper.
That they owe because of their loyalty and the political capital that they've built up within the Prime Minister's office. Now, you start questioning Prime Ministerial direction, you start questioning the decisions that are made in the Prime Minister's office, and you'll find yourself, like I did, sitting on the opposition side in the back corner where you need binoculars to see the Prime Minister during question period. You become such a backbencher. So careers are made through playing the game by their rules, and that is by not questioning matters and in fact becoming a sycophant. And that's unfortunate, but that's, I think, the end result of the system that you described, where people see themselves as being part of the Conservative establishment or part of the Liberal team as opposed to what they're supposed to do, and that is to represent their constituents as opposed to represent their party leadership.
Here's how you describe it in the book. Here, Sheldon, I'm on page 2 now at the top. For being the leader of the first government, not only in Canadian history, but in the history of the entire British Commonwealth, to have been found in contempt of Parliament, the Canadian electorate, quote unquote, punished the Prime Minister by electing 166 Conservative MPs, giving Stephen Harper his long-desired majority government. You made a stink about this. I mean, I don't mean to put it so colloquially. You raised what for you is clearly an issue of conscience and that you're very concerned about, and the public didn't see it that way. In fact, they went and gave him more support, and they gave him a majority government. So what does that say about how much we care about all of this?
Well, it's very disheartening. I mean, and it becomes a byproduct of the system perpetuates itself. When we have strong leaders and weak caucuses, we go into an election and people, and I agreed with you 10 minutes ago, that people make their voting decision primarily on the party or the leader as opposed to the representative that's running in that particular constituency. So that system has perpetuated itself. And as we said in the first few minutes of this interview, I think most people don't understand how the system is supposed to work, and that's allowed the system to come off the rails, where the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister have almost complete control over all of the parliamentary institutions, both the House and the Senate. And that leads to inadequate checks and balances, and in my observation and in my opinion, that leads to bad decisions, bad legislation, and scandal without anybody double-checking anybody else's work or activities.
And yet, somebody went and apparently counted up the votes on private members' bills and motions, and according to this, Conservative backbenchers voted with their government 76% of the time, Liberals 90% of the time, New Democrats 100% of the time. Does that suggest there's actually a lot more independent spirit in your former party than you think?
Well, there certainly is more than the other parties. As critical as I've been as to how Prime Minister Harper and his Prime Minister's office controls its backbenches, statistically, there's no doubt that the other caucuses run even tighter ships. And that's why I choose to sit as an independent. I'm going to run in the October election as independent because, I mean, changing party affiliations is not going to do anything to correct what I believe is the imbalance between the leaders' offices, all of the leaders' offices, and the members of parliament who are there to represent their constituents, not to represent their party leaders.
There's no reason to think this is going to be any better if another party's in power, is what you're saying.
Absolutely not. In fact, it might very well get worse.
Here's another excerpt from your book. This is a cute story. I recall one occasion a junior PMO staffer called my office demanding that a blog post I had written be removed because it was critical of the defense minister's handling of the CF-35 procurement, the fighter plane. I made myself deliberately unavailable so the PMO staffer was forced to speak instead to my employee in charge of posting to my website. My staffer stated that, quote, only Mr. Rathgeber has the authority to instruct me to post or remove things from his website. Incredulous, the PMO Prairie Issues Manager responded, you don't understand. I'm calling from the PMO. To this, my web manager responded, no, you don't understand. I work for Mr. Rathgeber. What's the lesson here?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting anecdote, and I salute my staffer for standing up to the Prime Minister's office.
Did they keep their job?
Oh yeah,
they did.
She's still there.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely, I support that. That anecdote is unlikely to actually occur inside the Ottawa bubble, where most staffers in Conservative members of Parliament live in fear of the phone call from the Prime Minister's office asking them to do something or to get their member to do something. Now, of course, the advantage of being in Alberta is we're 2 time zones away, and you know, the Prime Minister's office minion can't, you know, physically come into my constituency office and yell at my staff. So they're able to be slightly stronger in their conviction of what their job is, and that their loyalty is to me and not to the Prime Minister's office. But I think the moral of that story is that junior staffers, very junior staffers in the Prime Minister's office, think of members of Parliament and their staff as their employees, that we are somehow part of the extension of the communication branch of the Prime Minister's office. And we're not. Yes, at that time, I was a member of the caucus, and yes, Prime Minister Harper was my leader, but I look at my bosses as the constituents of Edmonton and St. Albert, and those are the individuals that I'm ultimately accountable, because those are the ones that sent me to Ottawa, not the junior staffer at the Prime Minister's office. But I absolutely will admit that many, if not most, members of Parliament don't see their world that way.
You live in Alberta.
I do.
You were once a member of the provincial Alberta government.
I was.
Led by Ralph Klein.
Yes.
Ralph Klein's a very successful politician.
Yes.
Won a lot of elections. He said, you play for the crest on the front of your jersey, not the name on the back. That's Ralph Klein.
Yeah.
You disagree?
Well, no. I mean, to some extent, yes. I mean, Premier Klein ran a much more democratic caucus than Premier Harper does. In those days, we had standing policy committees of caucus that vetted all legislation before it even made it onto the floor of the House of Commons. Certainly in the electoral context, which I think that anecdote refers to, during a 28 or 35-day writ period, it's important that all candidates are on the same page and that they sing from the same song sheet. And I think that's what he was referring to. But certainly to take that into the next phase of actually governing and legislating, to have to try to make a caucus homogenous and not have divergent opinions and everybody singing from the same song sheet, I think is disrespectful to the constituents that sent you to Parliament or to the legislature in the first place, and again removes the all-important checks and balances that any system of government or corporate or nonprofit governance requires. It needs people second-guessing each other's decisions.
But I can imagine, you can tell me if this actually happened, I can imagine the Prime Minister sitting you down and saying, Brent, I got the media after me, I got Liberals after me, I got New Democrats after me, I got a Supreme Court that's after me, I got a civil service that doesn't necessarily love me. There are all of these other institutions in this country that all are trying to put obstacles in front of my agenda. I can't have my backbench doing that as well. You have any sympathy for that position?
Well, not really, because we come at it from different angles. I mean, I'm a small C conservative. I'm a fiscal hawk. Socially, I'm very, very moderate. But fiscally, I'm an ultra-conservative. I believe in respect for taxpayers, and I believe in balanced budgets in the absence of some extraordinary circumstances when you can't have one. So when I criticize the government, it's because they're spending too much money on a F-35 procurement when we're nowhere closer to having a plane. Or when I criticize the government, it's because cabinet ministers are ordering $16 glasses of orange juice in five-star hotels in London.
You've mentioned that twice, but she lost her job, in fairness, right?
She did.
That's Bev Oda.
She did.
He got rid of her.
Eventually.
Eventually.
And I think the fact that it was both conservatives and members of the opposition and the media that were critical of that type of sense of entitlement, I think, is what ultimately, led to that decision to terminate her cabinet position. So when I'm critical of the government, it's from a very conservative perspective, and I would suggest more so than the other opposition parties, which come from the center or the center left. So I think it's important for a conservative government to be mindful and to be cognizant of criticism from the right or from the conservative for things like respect for taxpayers, transparency, open government. My private member's bill, which promoted open government and transparency. So I think. I don't think. The fact that this conservative government has rounded up 6 consecutive deficits is in no small part is because it doesn't, for the most part, accept criticism from its own conservative fiscal hawks at its backbenches. And that's unfortunate, and it's led to a very unflattering fiscal record. And now as we go into a time of economic challenge, I think they probably wish they had socked more money away when they had the opportunity.
Let me raise a new issue with you here. And I hear this from people from all political parties all the time, which is they're constantly beating the bushes looking for sharp, engaged, intelligent people to run for them in whatever election it may be. And you say this about that: I have come to conclude that political parties are actually not interested in recruiting bright and articulate candidates. Smart people tend to be critical thinkers. Critical thinking produces informed discussion, which is contrary to the political apparatus's goal of having a carefully crafted message that is delivered by torchbearers who stay on script and unequivocally support the party and the party leader. Now, this is concerning. Are you basically saying that there are no more independent thinking, critical, intelligent people in politics anymore because the payoff for being a trained seal on the backbench and just mindlessly slapping hands together for approval is omnipresent?
We're certainly moving in that direction, and if we don't reverse the trend towards the cult of the trained seal, we will eventually get there. I mean, you see that with individuals, and I'm not going to mention names, but you probably are not going to have a difficult time figuring out who I'm talking about. Individuals who had great careers in previous legal or business endeavors, and they come to Ottawa or to the Alberta legislature, and within 6 months, they've ceased to have sort of that independent thought process that served them so well in their previous career, and they become just another voice in the homogenous choir singing the praises of the government's record. And I think that's unfortunate. And I think for individuals who are accomplished and who have self-respect, becoming a backbench member of Parliament or even becoming a cabinet minister is not a particularly good career move for them, because they're going to find their independence beaten out of them real quick.
So in our last few minutes here, let's talk about how it could be different. How would you change things?
I think the cabinet has to become a lot smaller. The party discipline is cemented because of the pure mathematics. When you have almost half the caucus as either a parliamentary secretary or a cabinet minister, that promotes the cementing of party discipline, because if you play your cards right, keep your head down and your nose clean, your chances are about 1 in 2 or 1 in 2.5 that you're eventually going to have some sort of executive position. Now contrast that to Great Britain, where the House is twice as big and the cabinet almost half as small. Individuals there take their role as parliamentarians much more seriously, and you see much, Margaret Thatcher, for example, lost 22 votes in the British House of Commons in her 9 years as a majority prime minister.
But they have a different view of it there. They They're okay with losing a few votes along the way, and they think the empire's not going to end.
And so should we be. Now, the American system takes it even further. They have complete separation of powers. I would say too much separation of powers because it leads to gridlock and not getting things done. But the point is when you run for the U.S. Congress, you're running to be a legislator. You're not running to be part of the cabinet. You're not running to be a part of some future executive. And I think British members of Parliament look at their role the same way because mathematically it's quite unlikely that they're going to make it in. Now, I think 1 in 30 is the mathematical probability of getting in, as opposed to Ottawa where it's about 1 in 2.5. So we need to make our cabinet smaller. I think we need to make our parliamentary secretaries much smaller or even eliminate them completely. We have to reinstill the value of being a member of Parliament as being an individual there that's there to represent your constituents, pass law and hold government to account, rather than the constant auditioning for a role in a future cabinet. And all parties are guilty of this. The governing party, individuals want to move from the back to the mid to the front benches, and the opposition parties, they tend to embarrass the government for the government's sakes so that they can win the next election, so that they can become the future executive. And we're never going to get back to responsible government as long as everybody who runs for Parliament is just running to be a cabinet minister, as opposed to what you're supposed to be running for, and that's member of Parliament to represent your constituents.
Do cabinet ministers, based on your experience there, have any power, much power, some power?
It depends. I mean, there are a handful of ministers in the current regime that have the respect and have earned it, quite frankly.
Name names.
Well, I have Minister Kenny,
Jason Kenney from
Minister
Alberta.
Moore,
James Moore from BC.
Minister Baird.
John Baird from Ontario.
These individuals, I think, do run their departments with a minimum of interference from the Prime Minister's office. But we see other ministries where the minister is simply a conduit between the Prime Minister's office and the House, and between the Prime Minister's office and the general public. You see them doing nothing but reading talking points, never going off script.
Want to mention names there?
Not really, but I would say probably most of the ones that I didn't mention in your first question. And you watch them. You watch them in the House of Commons. They're reading talking points. They're on script because they haven't earned that respect and the confidence of the Prime Minister's office. And that's unfortunate, because some of these people, I think if they were given a little bit of leeway, could probably develop into very competent administrators of their departments and spokespersons for the government.
Just finally, how disappointed are you in Canadians themselves that they don't appear to be more exercised about all this?
Well, it's very frustrating. I mean, our voter participation rates are now about 60% federally, 50% in most provinces, municipally much lower than that. Canadians seem disengaged, and it's difficult to blame them because I think the perception, certainly when you get farther away from central Canada, in Alberta, for example, I think younger generations especially have a perspective of, why should I vote? The individual's not going to represent me anyways. He's just going to go there and work towards his pension and shill for the party that represents him. So voter participation, I think, is getting at critically low levels, and part of that is because of the cynicism, because I think the perception is that the representatives are not doing their job in representing their constituents.
Well, you've raised some great issues, and I want to thank you for coming to TVO tonight to discuss them. Irresponsible government, the decline of parliamentary democracy in Canada, with a foreword by our friend Andrew Coyne. Brent Rathgeber has been our guest. Thanks so much for coming into TVO tonight.
Thank you for your interest.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.